Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, trust me, I'm an economist. I'm not, actually. It's not a phrase I suppose my guest of the day, Linda Yu, utters every day, and economists have had a rough ride of it of late. Blamed for not predicting the financial crisis 9 years ago, a good number then got criticised for scaremongering over what might happen after Brexit. But is that fair? Here's Ellie.
It was a question that baffled lots of us, even the Queen, who famously asked, how did no one predict the financial crisis? She got an answer of sorts, and then said what we were all thinking.
But people had got a bit lax, you know?
Maybe it wasn't that simple.
A little bit like geologists and earthquakes. We know where the fault lines are. We've got a pretty good idea of where the earthquake will happen. But within a few years, we don't know exactly when and which region will be hit the most. And it was very much like that in the lead-up financial crisis. If you read any of the journals that were out there, academic journals and policy papers, it was clear we understood the risks. We just didn't quite know, if I could carry on with that analogy, exactly where the earthquake would hit.
Good afternoon to you. Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But
here's another analogy then. Economists can forecast based on certain conditions, but we shouldn't think of them as predicting the future. There's another problem too.
Well, it's actually a central theorem of financial economics that you can't predict things like the financial crisis, because it's in the nature of such predictions that the result of predicting it in a reliable way would mean that it wouldn't happen. So if I tell you the stock market's going to drop by 20% tomorrow, then you won't have your money in the market tomorrow. So it'll drop the day before or the day before that. So I won't be right. The crash that I predict won't happen.
So is that what happened after the EU referendum?
You've got a situation today where you've got a Conservative Chancellor and a Labour Chancellor both saying to the country that there would be a big hole in the public finances.
Brexiteers called it Project Fear, a consensus among economics types, including the then Chancellor, that Brexit and the vote to leave would damage the British economy.
Economists overplayed their hand significantly on Brexit in two key ways. I think that they claimed to be expert about matters that they weren't expert in, namely what some of the political implications would be both of staying in the EU and of leaving. And secondly, when things didn't play out as they expected, they tried to suggest that that was something to do with the economic models that they were using, instead of taking on the chin that they'd got wrong at least what the economy believed would be the long-term implications.
Economics and predictions. That's what this was all about yesterday. The budget was full of forecasts and policies based on forecasts. But maybe it's the politicians who don't use economics properly.
The choices they make may not fully reflect the consensus of economics. They may be a result of their own private preferences or a result of the way that they have to confront their own parties or the political agenda in front of them. The best politicians, it seems to me, are ones that can understand what the science says, whether it's on global warming or smoking or the impact of introducing trade costs, and confront that and design policies to deal with the real risks that are out there.
When it comes to predicting, maybe it's not economics at fault, but the economists themselves, politicians and the public's unpredictable behaviour that makes it so difficult.
And joining us now is Joe Gladstone, a behavioural economist from University College London. Never mind about predictions, I can't even say the word. Why do economists keep getting it wrong?
Well, one of the reasons that it's very difficult to predict the future with economic models is that economists want to have a theory of everything. They want to turn people into little robots that always try and maximise their own well-being. But you and I know that that's not really how people behave. Humans are irrational, they make mistakes, and if these models don't take that into account, then what do they really tell us?
Right, well, in that basis, we know that humans aren't rational in that sense. So what is the point of all this forecasting?
Yeah, I'm not really sure sometimes. You know that phrase, is that economic forecasting exists to make astrology look respectable. And I guess I think the problem with policy, anyways, is that you need to have some basis to decide how the economy is going to be in the future. And I think so there is a need to make forecasts. But what I don't like is the excessive reliance on forecasts. And the other thing I don't like about forecasts generally is that it does rely too much on simple models of how people, if you have a tax cut, people will go spend more. But we know that's not true. A lot of people save. They're struggling. Why would they spend more even if you had a tax cut? So you put all that together, it does require rethinking the bases of economic forecasting, but also accepting it's there for the likes of the Treasury, the OBR. They need something to say, is the economy expanding or shrinking, but we shouldn't put too much stress that it's actually our future.
And it's not just people who don't behave in a sort of linear way, if you like. I mean, markets don't always function properly. In fact, some would say they haven't functioned well at all over the last decade.
That's absolutely true. So, people are imperfect and markets are imperfect. And these models are not always very good at distinguishing between those. I mean, the reality is that if we could all predict the future with some whizzy model, then we'd go and set up a hedge fund and be a billionaire next year.
Yes, I wouldn't be sitting here.
We'd be joining you.
So it's just that complexity, the chaos of all these individuals with their complex minds and personalities and individualisms, and then the market as well, which is also complex and doesn't form normal ways of doing things.
But people do want to see evidence of what policies are based on, and there has to be some sort of forecasting. So do we help the situation by criticising it all the time and dismissing it and saying, well, all your forecasts are always wrong, so I'm never going to believe anything you say? Or does that just make the job of economic forecasting even more difficult?
So first we have to accept that the world's uncertain and that we cannot know with a huge degree of accuracy what's going to happen in future. So we have to accept that. And then the best models that we have are probably from economists. It's not like there's an alternative. We can't go to the psychologists or the sociologists and say, tell us what the economy is going to do over the next 5 years. So we have to just accept the limitations of what we have and try and figure out how you can explain that to the public, that the world is uncertain and this model is the best thing we have.
Right. I mean, so we wouldn't be better off without economic forecasting. How could it be made better?
I think one way it could be made better is right now it tends to extrapolate a lot from the past. Almost every single model is essentially saying what's happened in the past. And if you haven't had a recession in the last 8 years, you're unlikely to predict one in the coming years. So the first thing to do is to maybe reduce the reliance on extrapolation. Natural experiments, for instance, around the impact of taxes and government spending give you a better sense of what in the US is called dynamic scoring of policy. So you put a policy out, you think this how people will behave, and then you try and cost it on that basis.
But do you need more time for that to happen? Because policies are done, so you have a tax cut or a tax rise, and you only have it in place for 1 or 2 years. Is that long enough to say a policy's worked or failed?
Yeah, that's really tricky. And actually, what I'm describing also takes a lot more preparation before you roll out policies, so you can decide what the impact is likely to be. But as we know, politicians work on about 4 or 5 year cycles, and so a lot of time generally isn't a luxury they have.
Right, and everybody says they've got their own economic expert to back up whatever policy there is. I mean, isn't that the problem? You can pretty well forecast or predict whatever sort of economics you like, because there'll always be an economic expert to back it up.
There's certainly variations in opinion, and it's certainly possible to go and find an expert who's likely to support your case. But at the same time, there is better and worse science. Things are moving forward. There is a gold standard in terms of these field experiments or natural experiments. So it isn't like we're just walking around in the dark. There is the science out there. The problem is that science is complicated. It's difficult to explain to the public. It's difficult to turn into a policy soundbite. And so that's really the problem we have in politicians using this information.
Jo Gladstone, thank you very much. Well, economics may be difficult to forecast, but I have to say politics hasn't been that easy to forecast either.